So how do you resolve that? What's the answer to it? Maybe you can educate me as a professor, because I don't know. I don't understand that. Is there a way to, if these two things are tied up together that way, politically and economically, like the issue of the Mexican border with the United States of America and the aid of the United States of America to Ukraine are tied up that hard? How can we, what do we do? Well, I mean...
Well, let me first address the issue of the aid. Biden absolutely wants to address the issue. For one thing, his political fortunes are entirely tied to Ukraine's victory.
Right.
There is no Biden without Ukrainian victory. And frankly, there is no Democratic Party without Ukrainian victory. He absolutely needs to see Putin defeated. And it's both pragmatic, it's political, and it's also ideological, because Biden and, after all, the Democratic Party absolutely stands for the rule of law and democracy, and Putin, we know what Putin stands for. I do not have to elaborate, for everything that is anti-democratic and criminal, ultimately. So Biden absolutely needs to come up with a solution. And he indicated every time he has been speaking lately, at every press conference, he indicated that yes, he will compromise. He will compromise on the border issue. He will tighten the regulations.
Great.
He will ultimately reduce the flow of immigrants. Now, let's be honest here. The Republicans don't really, truly want to cut down.
That's the apple of discord. Right, here we go.
Exactly. So we're dealing with a surface phenomena. We're not dealing with anything profound. We're dealing with rhetoric. And that is the hardest thing. Okay, the Republicans really want to close the borders, but they don't really want to close the borders.
Well, of course. I mean, now that they're losing all the influence otherwise. They don't have the problem to address to then. They would have to face the issue that Ukraine have to win. Otherwise, the American soldiers would have to step on the battlefield and fight this fight.
But even more prosaically, the most immediate issues, lack of immigration will put farmers in the bind. Most of the agricultural work in America is not done by Americans. It's done by the newcomers, and the farmers tend to vote Republican. So if you start cutting down also all sorts of food industry, like industries where, say, meat processing farms, chicken processing factories, they all absolutely rely on immigrant labor, and those people tend to vote Republican. So we're dealing with rhetoric. We're not dealing with facts, really. We're not dealing with deep motivations. And that's one of the problems Biden has to address. He has to make loud enough gestures, obvious enough gestures to mollify the Republicans, to make Republicans feel that they are winning something, and put the Republicans in a position when they can't really refuse. And so it's really a political dance, an ugly dance, but the dance. There's very little internal substance to it. It's all internal politics. And of course, it is connected to the upcoming elections in the year. And so the rhetoric and the ugliness is intensified. What underneath that rhetoric, if you like, I will tell you about the sad mechanisms. There's basically an anti-democratic wave in America as well. So the sympathies with Putin, unfortunately, it's not just rhetorical. It actually goes deeper. It's the same wave of stepping away from modernity, stepping away from modern problems, abandoning basically ideas of modern contemporary respect for an individual. It's all there. We can see that American right wing is very similar in a way to Putin's ideological stance: anti-women, anti-abortion, anti-gays, hysteria over transgender, people. You can see the striving towards the reestablishing of a conservatively supported hierarchy with a certain either gender or gender and race on top, and everybody else sort of somewhat subservient to it. It is the conservative wave that we see, of course, in Europe. We see that Russia actually makes it into an ideology that rules the country, and unfortunately, we see the same thing in America. And that maybe is the real crux of the man.
Well, yeah, maybe that super tolerance that is so popular in Europe, tolerance to almost everything, and which is actually sometimes a permissiveness, an absolute permissiveness. Here we go. It causes an absolute intolerance when it touches the base with ignorance and the lack of education, and that's where the populisms come out. But let me be more straight in my question. Next question: what kind of support can Ukraine really expect for next year? What would you say?
I want to be optimistic, or at least somewhat optimistic. I think
Right. Okay.
I think Biden will indeed cave in on some demands on the border, particularly because it's a bipartisan issue. A lot of Democrats as well as Republicans know that something has to be done, because indeed it's a chaotic and disorderly process. And the last time the rules and laws dealing with immigration were really hammered out in the 90s. So it's really time for the government to set new standards and new regulations. So I would imagine Biden is going to cave in on a lot of Republican demands. He has signaled that already. Republicans will have to take a deep breath and pass the legislation. Sometimes things happen at the very last moment. Frankly, I can't be this optimistic that I don't want to exclude that the Congress will get its act together and yes, will come up with the decision right now before they leave for the Christmas break. But it's not out of the question. In January, it's more likely it will happen in January. That's my optimistic prognosis. Sooner or later, the aid package will meet with the congressional approval.
I just loved it. Congress, just get yourself together already. That was lovely. I mean, it was a beautiful stance and it would be a beautiful saying. But if that would be for you to decide, what would you do, Professor, to resolve the issue with the Mexican border this way or the other, to make this package released in favor of Ukraine as soon as possible?
Well, the border is a very complicated issue, truly.
Indeed,
I could not take it upon myself to make decisions. Well, one thing is clear, that whatever American government decides, it should be done in a humane manner, because humanity and the respect for human rights, that's where the Democrats should really not cave in. When Trump was separating families at the border, that was a disgrace. It was disgrace to the values that Americans uphold. And indeed, it resulted in human tragedy. Some children were literally lost. Their parents were deported. The children were held in separate facilities. And in the end, there are quite a few children that never found their parents, or the parents could never recover their children. That was contrary to American values. So whatever government agrees to do, this should not violate the principle of human rights and humanity in general. There are some pieces of legislation that Republicans are proposing that are going to be cruel, such as detention of families. Right now, families crossing the border are not detained because of small children. The detention of families, that's something that is not a good idea. That's clearly...
Yeah, it very reminds me of someone in the Kremlin. That's what he does in Ukraine. He just kidnaps children and sends them to Russia. And Trump does the same with the Mexican children on the border. So you can't probably protect law using unlawful methods. at some point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, you're not only destroying the families of the newcomers, but you're also destroying the moral fabric of your own society.
Yeah.
And that would be tragic. You increase the tolerance, you normalize cruelty, and then what does the United States stand for in the end? Right. So whatever they do at the border, that should be absolutely preserved. And that's where the limit should be drawn.
Ma'am, thank you so very much for your expertise.